Yo, it's Marco Catania again, representing Charles Sturt University, subject coordinator for ITI 597, had a subject that covers IT service management according to ITIL version 3. Hey, in the topic today we're going to talk about a release policy. What's a release policy all about? Yeah, all these documents, what's a policy and what's a procedure and what's a process? Let's try to get rid of some of the confusion out there. So, type of document, a policy. A policy explains the why. It sets the guidelines, the constraints, the limits for the organization. This is how we work, okay? It often policies they help you to set like the culture of an organization. A process description typically talks about like objectives. Why are we doing change management? What are we trying to achieve? Inputs, activities, and outputs. So process descriptions, it's all about like what are we trying to achieve, what are the inputs, what are the activities, and what are the outputs. Procedures are more like documents that like explain the what, the when, the where, and the who of like certain steps you need to follow to achieve a certain output. A work instruction explains the how. Okay, a work instruction is typically like a document that describes in detail how to do a certain step, often a step from a procedure. A role description, or like a position description, that really explains who is doing what. So we're now linking like people to like activities or like roles to activities. So here you've got a bit of like a framework of like all the documents you typically come across or you typically see within like an IT service management environment. So what's a release policy according to ITIL? Well, it says like the policy should at least like contain information on like identifying, numbering, and like naming all your releases. It should talk about the various roles and responsibilities at each stage, like building, testing, and like deploying. It should talk about the frequency for each type of release. So how often are we, for example, releasing minor, and how often are we releasing like major changes? It needs an approach for accepting and grouping changes into a release. Okay, a release is nothing more and nothing less than one or more approved changes like bundled together or grouped together. Okay, so what type of like releases are we allowed to combine without, for example, putting the organization at too much risk? What type of like automation mechanisms are we going to use? Because automation typically makes things more like efficient and more effective. How are we going to use configuration baselines? And how are we going to compare the release, for example, to like the original baseline and the original configuration? How do we know we're actually dealing and working with the right stuff? We need like entry and exit criteria for each stage. So when do we move from like development to build? And when do we move from build to test? And when do we move from test to deployment? We need like also a couple of statements on like early life support. How, when, where, you name it. And also like handover criteria. So at some stage there's like this cutover point where like, hey, the release is no longer part of like service transition. The release is now part of service operation. You guys have fun with it. We're going to do something else. So a release policy needs to really like cover all these bullet points as you see like in front of you. Let's see if I can clarify release cycle stages a little bit further for you because they were used on the previous slide. If I'm not mistaken, you can actually identify like 4 different areas within your release management world or within your release management process. Development, build, test, and live production. Development area, that's where like the people are like hammering away on their keyboards. The coders are hammering away on their keyboards, writing new, for example, software. Once they've done their job and they've released their like version 2 of a certain application, it goes into the so-called like DML, Definitive Media Library, where the builders they take like the software out of the library and they start to like, for example, install the software on a specific server on a specific platform. Once they've done their job, it should be tested by an independent tester. And once the tests have been performed and are given like the green light, you then actually deploy your new like infrastructure like hardware, software, and so on into the live production environment. So all these areas really fall within control or under control of release management. Okay, development, build, test, and like production. Some more terminology I used on the release policy slide earlier. Major, minor, and emergency releases. Major releases normally contain large areas of new functionality. Often you'll be going from like a version 1 to a version 2. Minor releases normally contain small enhancements and fixes. So you may be moving from like a version 1.1 to a version 1.2, but overall it's still the same, well, high level the same functionality. Emergency releases normally contain the corrections to a small number of known errors or high priority enhancements. So you may be moving from a version 1.1.1 to a version 1.1.2. Major releases typically embed or supersede minor releases, which typically embed or supersede emergency releases. So yeah, once you've got a whole bunch of like emergency releases, you bundle them up into like the next minor release. Once you've got a whole bunch of minor releases, you bundle them up into the next major release. So this is some of the terminology you will be seeing also within release policies. Chew, Muskie! Practice what you preach. Yeah. Hey, of course it's about understanding the concept of working with like release policies. Think about the consequences of releasing IT service assets. Think of like resources and capabilities with a frequency that's either too low or too high. For example, type of release, major release. If the frequency is too low, you may be losing your competitive edge. If the frequency is too high, you've got a constant interruption of business productivity. For a minor release, if the frequency is too low, well, you're typically waiting too long for your fixes. If the frequency is too high, you're in a constant state of like never-ending change. For your emergency releases, if the frequency is too low, well, you've got increased vulnerabilities and risk. But if the frequency is too high, you get an image that the business can't plan properly anymore. So think about some more examples and you can add to this table. Have fun. Yeah, what's up, Doc? It's a simple question. Hey, which one of the following statements is incorrect considering the concept of a release policy? Answer A. It covers unique identification of releases. Answer B. It covers release types and their frequency. Answer C. It covers early life support and handover criteria. And answer D. It covers detailed performance and availability targets as set by the customer. I'll give you a couple of seconds to think about the answer and then we'll move on as usual. Okay, and the answer is answer D. Okay, it covers detailed performance and availability targets as set by the customer. Well, that's the stuff you typically find in like a so-called like service level agreement. I wouldn't put that into like a release policy. But A, B, and C, that's typically stuff you would find in a release policy. Next topic. We've got some good news and we've got some bad news. The good news is we've come to the end of our generic concepts and definitions videos. And the bad news is like we're going to start with like our key principles and models videos. So there's heaps more to come, okay? In the next topic, we're going to define and explain the concept of like value creation. So how do we create value by delivering services as part of our service strategy volume? Hey, until then, live long and prosper. En nano nano. En as always, I'll be back.